Welcome to the second debate of this term, which is this House believes a second Trump presidency will be more beneficial for the United Kingdom. We have four speakers, two from the proposition, Sibylla Hamilton and Jamie Parker Ward, and two for the opposition, Ethan Lees and George Richmond, in place of Matt Alderton, but it'll be Matt Alderton's speech which is being said. And then after the debate, we will have two guest speakers, Sarah Elliott from the Republicans Overseas UK and Professor Bill Barnard from the Democrats Abroad UK. And I'll give more sort of information about both of them after the main debate. So the way that the debate itself is going to be structured is that it will be the proposition can make a 5-minute speech. The first minute and the last minute, no one's kind of allowed to interrupt, but the intermediary 3 minutes, if you have a point of information, you can sort of use the raise your hand function on your screen, and the speaker can choose whether or not to kind of accept that and hear a question. After the first proposition and the first opposition speaker have both spoken, there'll be an opportunity for sort of questions to be asked. So if you have any questions throughout the whole kind of debate, then put them in the chat and I'll read them out for the speakers. Then there will be the second round of proposition and opposition speakers, same process again, any questions for all the speakers, and we'll sort of go through them and answer them. Before the debate itself, we're going to take a vote on the motion, so whether or not you support, disapprove or abstain on it, and then we'll take another vote at the end of the debate. And the way we're going to do this vote is just using the sort of, again, raise your hand or thumbs up function on the Zoom screen, because it's not letting us create a poll, unfortunately, at the moment. So with that, if you'd like to vote kind of now, if you agree with the motion that this House believes a second Trump presidency will be more beneficial for the UK. Just give it about 30 seconds for anyone to do that. And then vote now if you disagree that a second Trump presidency will be more beneficial for the UK. And again, another 20 or so seconds. Okay, and then now vote if you've got any kind of abstentions. So yeah. Okay, in that case, I think we can move straight on to our first proposition speaker, which is Sibylla Hamilton.
Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Fitzwilliam Debating Society. I believe that a second Trump presidency would be beneficial in the UK, and I'm going to start by outlining a couple of points from the motion. Firstly, Jamie and I would like to outline that we are referring to the UK, and specifically the UK and not the rest of the world, when we talk about the benefits. And secondly, when we refer to a Trump presidency, this could include the House being split, and this is very important considering we are anti-Trump, but when we're considering the sort of government we are supporting, it's important to consider the amount of power that Trump could or couldn't have despite still being president. My overarching reason why I believe that Trump is needed is because Trump is safer for Brexit. Jamie is going to go on to talk about the benefits of the military, the relative positions of the UK and the US, and discuss more the option of a split house and the implications this will have. Now, my debate is going to be hinged on 3 points: Britain, Brexit, and Biden. And these are the 3 reasons why I think that Trump would be beneficial for the UK. Now, Britain, the status quo that we're in is in dire need of help. We have had 700,000 people lose their jobs because of the pandemic. We had 2 consecutive economic disasters in the last few years, one avoidable, one unavoidable. We're now in uncharted waters and in dire need of help. We need support if we're going to get through this without extreme job loss and poverty and massive economic problems in the future. And we cannot do this alone. It is in our best interests to look for a suitable economic partner in the future, particularly as we leave the European Union and we lose those benefits. The reason why America is such an ideal partner for Britain is because the US is the world's largest economy and the largest exporter and importer. They are a sort of beacon in this storm that we are in of economic problems. This leads me on to my second point, Brexit. If Trump stays in power, we will be in a much stronger position to recover from Brexit and from the pandemic. We are going to end up with a bad deal or a no deal. We have got 2 months for Boris Johnson to come to an agreement with the EU, and it was only last week he was huffing about the EU and saying that there was no point talking to them. He has put himself in a very difficult position with only 2 months left. What are the chances we get a good deal? Even if we do, we're facing higher costs of electricity, of gas, of imported goods. If we have a bad deal, these problems are even greater. And if we have a no deal, there's a $32 billion loss that could potentially happen. America is our best option facing Brexit. We need to survive, and Brexit is our only, Trump is our only solution to surviving. So now I've outlined the position of urgent dependency that Britain is in and the importance of America in particular to help Brexit. But why Trump instead of Biden in this position? This leads me to my third point, Biden. He is unashamedly pro-EU, and we need someone who could side with us. Boris Johnson and Biden aren't going to have a special relationship. Trump and Boris Johnson already have a special relationship, and this is integral when we're talking about the massive compromises and issues that need to be solved in order to reach a good economic deal for us. Biden has openly stated his reluctance in forming a good US-UK trade deal, and under Obama, Obama famously stated that we will be at the back of the queue in terms of forming a UK-US trade agreement if Brexit went through, and it has gone through, and now we're about to have Biden come into power. We will not get a good deal unless Trump is president. Biden is also pro-Labour. Our current Prime Minister, no matter what everyone's political beliefs are, we are in a Conservative government, and Boris Johnson needs to have a good deal, a good situation with Trump in order to reach a good deal. In conclusion, we're looking towards a more powerful future, a richer future, and a future with more jobs if Trump is in power for another presidency. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we then move on to our first opposition speaker, which is Ethan Lees.
Thank you. Well, the question of whether a second Trump presidency compared to the last 4 years and compared to Biden would benefit Britain is a question of what Britain's relationship with America is, what it could be, and whether a future under Trump is a future for our own national interest. But what is our national interest? If it's to fulfill the desires of the British people, then what at all can Trump do that we'd accept? A recent poll has shown that in a country which has rejected the EU, despite its populist alignment with our own government, only 19% of Britons have confidence in Trump as a leader. That's an approval rate less than Johnson. It's one similar to Putin. It's an approval rate that, to put it simply, does not inspire any confidence. Despite this, and despite what the Trump victory represents, another victory for populism and a confirmation of our own government's brinkmanship policy on Brexit, this break-off from the regional powers of the world might actually present the UK with a tremendous opportunity. Instead of relying on the party politics of Europe and America, UK can instead transcend both EU regionalism and US isolationism through the internationalism of global frameworks, such as the United Nations, and maintain security through international treaties like NATO. However, this is exactly why, if we compare the promises of Biden compared to the actions of Trump, we find that to best maintain our national interest, to maintain our position of power, influence, and respect in world affairs, and the safety of our people, that we will ultimately be better off under a Biden presidency than a continued Trump administration. Not since the 1940s would the United Kingdom see the far-reaching results of the coming election most clearly. It coincides with the electoral fate of populism, the COVID pandemic, and the ongoing economic depression which us young people are going to face. I'm not going to talk about the morality of electing a man like Donald Trump for another 4 years, regardless of how much you may like or dislike Biden. I won't talk about how a victory for Trump is a victory for populism, and we all like it or not, further embolden the Conservative Party of this country. As a student who's dedicated much of my free time to studying international affairs, I want to showcase how Trump's embarrassing foreign policy spent another 4 years of impotence for the UK if he is elected. If the American people elect Biden, a candidate who's opposed Brexit and supports closer ties with the EU, as mentioned, the leaders of this country will have to take a more cautious and measured approach, a smarter approach to its negotiations in leading the EU. It means that brinkmanship as a negotiating tactic must cease. It means that the UK will not be able to break international law as it has, which has only served to make this nation look more like a rogue state than an integral, intelligent, respected agent in world politics. It's true that a US president which seeks closer ties to our economic competitors may in the short term pose a disadvantage to our country, but this government has had a policy of complacency about our influence, of complacency about our special relationship that has to end. A Biden victory would serve as the kick our Foreign Office needs to turn our policy around and become a nation that works with our European allies instead of fighting them. And this isn't a view shared only by Remainders or Democrats. Our own diplomats have stated that there is a sense of dread in dealing with the Trump administration. Biden holds the image of a professional president, like Obama, who he served under, capable of rational, stable diplomacy. Anyone who supported Trump on the basis that he would not entangle the United States in foreign wars can remember the shock mere months after his election, when immediately after seeing images of an alleged gas attack by the Assad regime, that Trump launched nearly 60 Tomahawk missiles at a government airbase in Chiraq, destabilizing the Middle East, a region where armed soldiers are fighting and dying to an even larger quagmire of chaos. Even when he did pull out soldiers, involving himself in the morality of civil war, before abandoning the cause of the Kurds against an increasingly authoritarian Turkey, he did so without alerting us. Just this year, Trump's hostile relationship with Iran and the destruction of diplomatic efforts between the two nations, of great concern to our own national security, has, when combined with the growing instabilities in the Mediterranean, Kashmir, Azerbaijan, the Chinese sphere, it's brought our world the closest to total war since World War II. How does that benefit our country? But the United States and its own armed forces, our armed forces, are not the only means of security that we possess. NATO, after all, is the greatest defensive alliance which unites the Atlantic. At this point, it should come as no surprise that in keeping with Trump's America First isolationism, he plans on defunding NATO upon his re-election. This is an administration that has locked and loaded hundreds of millions of dollars into war, but groans at the prospect of investing in peace. And what of peace? Of international cooperation, of the United Nations, opposed by Trump. The historical effectiveness of the UN and peacekeeping has unfortunately relied upon the attitude of US presidents towards it. And between Trump and Biden, the choice between re-signing the Paris Accords or continuing to ignore them for coal and shale gas, between working with China, the world's largest air polluter, constructively to challenge climate change, or to only antagonize them, between seeing our world as a collective of people who, behind it all, want to work together for the peace and prosperity of humankind, or as a monster that the US should hide from, like it's tried so many times before, and only hasn't, because its people elected those who believe that the power of the United States should be used, idealistically or not, should be used for the betterment of humanity. The choice could not be any clearer. And therefore, not only for the United Kingdom, but for the sake of humanity, I ask you to oppose this motion tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ethan. Reminder to the audience that you can ask questions in the chat and they can go to any of the speakers at the end of this debate. So we're going to move to our second proposition speaker in that case, which is Jamie Parker Ward.
Thank you, Sean. So before I kind of start, I'm just going to put my timer on actually. Just wait a second. So before I start, I just kind of want to preface that obviously my argument isn't necessarily that a Trump election would be great for the US. I mean, if I was in the US, I'd probably vote for Biden myself. But the question is specifically, is it good for the UK? And I think the opposition has kind of taken a very optimistic view of internationalism and diplomacy. I mean, first of all, the opposition spoke about transcending to internationalism and aligning ourselves with the UN, which I find quite strange because the UN is widely known to be extremely ineffective in its means and in its aims. So the idea that we're just all of a sudden going to ignore our closest allies in America, who have helped us to achieve diplomacy in a bunch of areas, just to do the UN, seems like a strange route to me. I do take on board the idea that some of the US's foreign policy under the Trump administration has been skeptical at some times, but I do note that the idea that the UK will have to take a more cautious approach in the Brexit negotiations if Trump is not re-elected and Biden gets re-elected is very optimistic about how the UK government operates. I mean, we've seen how the UK government operates under Boris Johnson, which is they are very headstrong and they will believe anything. And even if any opposing information comes to them, they will ignore it. The amount of times the EU has told Boris Johnson that he can't do something, or Theresa May that he can't do something, and he's continued to just do it anyway, shows that like this UK government doesn't care about what other countries say that it should do. So the idea that if Biden told the UK government all of a sudden that they couldn't do what they wanted to do with Ireland, and that the UK government would just go, oh, well, I guess we're going to have to take a more cautious approach about that, does seem very optimistic about the UK government. The fact of the matter is, if Biden tells us that we cannot do the thing, we cannot allow Ireland's sovereignty to be compromised and the Good Friday Agreement, the fact of the matter is, the UK government will, in all likelihood, ignore it. And all that will happen is we'll go to the back of the trade deal, and then there will be no trade deal with the US. And it's vital that we get a trade deal with the US. Look at how many trade deals we've already agreed already. It's only one, and it's with Japan. And Japan, our trade deal, will only account for 0.07% of our GDP. That's tiny compared to the amount of trade that we had with the EU. And it will continue to be tiny unless we can find a trade deal with the US, which, as we've argued previously, will be much more likely under Trump. I also look at the point made about NATO defunding. But the problem with this idea is that the Republicans would not support the idea of NATO defunding, even if Trump did. So you've got to kind of separate sometimes Trump's words with actually his actions. And sometimes what he says is frankly impossible to achieve. The Paris Accord, while sad that he has left it, again, I'm not sure that rejoining it would accomplish much anyway. It's mostly a symbolic gesture. And the idea that all of a sudden Biden would be able to make China give in to its every demand about climate and all of a sudden become this absolute pariah of climate change and completely getting rid of carbon emissions by like 2025 seems like a totally optimistic utopian view of the world that frankly doesn't really accord with reality. So I'm now going to go on to my points, which are mainly that Republicans and Trump being re-elected would actually be quite beneficial for military. For one, Trump hasn't actually gone into any wars. Yes, he cites the bombing in Syria, but compared to Barack Obama and George W. Bush, who pulled America into several wars, I think, frankly, Trump somehow has done quite well in that regard. And also, the Republicans spend more on military, so it's more likely to make the UK safer as well, because obviously we have quite strong ties with the US military. Also, as Sibylla mentioned, the likelihood of Trump being re-elected, but also that the Democrats would still control the House, is extremely likely. The likelihood that Trump gets elected, according to 538, which is a polling forecaster, is about 12%, but the chances he wins the House are about 5%, so it's extremely likely that he'll win the House. And so that a lot of things that we saw as damaging in the first Trump administration probably actually won't happen in the second administration because he won't have the votes for it. And also, there's also the relative positions of the two countries to take into account. For one, if we think that the US is really ruining its international reputation, surely that makes the UK in a stronger position, because if the US is struggling, the UK by extension appears to be doing better. And let's be honest, it's not like France are doing well, because Emmanuel Macron's not doing well, and Germany's going to have a problem because Angela Merkel's leaving. So relatively, we will be doing better. Anyway, that concludes my speech, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamie. In that case, we'll move on to our second opposition speaker, which is George Richmond.
Thank you. Sean. And yes, today I'm actually being someone else. I'm Matt Alderton, and I'm reading his speech. And it is based on his experiences, as you'll hear from the first sentence. I am currently on a train, utilising Britain's great public transport, a transportation network that would be under threat if Trump wins on the 3rd. In the post-Brexit days, Britain is carving a new future in the world. In this future, we will have to make concessions to future trade partners. Trump has made it clear he thinks about America and only America. Therefore, he will have no qualms on carving out as much as he possibly can from the US. Biden, on the other hand, understands the need for a strong Britain and will therefore use American power to support us in our aims, a factor that my partner will go into further detail or has gone into further detail already. Do we not have a moral obligation to oppose Trump? The numerous and high-profile scandals that has engulfed both America and the Trump administration has brought shame on the Western world and destabilized not just the UK, but also the world as a whole. Biden would bring a sense of sanity to the White House that would help to heal many of the wounds that currently exist in the world. This is not to say that Biden is a saint. Indeed, far from it, he has his flaws. However, these flaws pale in comparison to Trump's. While you may disagree with Biden on certain policies, and indeed I do, he will not be as polarizing as Trump has been and will continue to be. The UK has close political, economic, and cultural links to the US, and an unstable US means an unstable UK. With Brexit and COVID, the UK does not need any more instability. Therefore, we need in Britain a candidate who will bring America, and by extension, the world, together. And thus, ladies and gentlemen, I commend my speech to the House, and I ask you to vote against this motion tonight.
Thank you very much, George / Matt. If anyone does have any questions, now is probably the right time to put them in the chat for any of the speakers on any point that's raised or anything they haven't raised.
I did have a point of information if I'm allowed to.
Go on.
Okay. So you mentioned in the speech that like a Biden administration would bring stability, and that's what we need at the moment. Well, surely the thing that would bring us the most stability is a trade deal with the US and not the possibility of a huge economic recession because we're on WTO trade agreement terms.
Does either opposition speaker want to come back to that?
Am I meant to answer this, or is this with George?
Either of you can.
Look, I can't speak for Matt's speech, but you know, look, I'm not here to talk about economy. As you could in my area, my focus is on international relations. But it's clear that as a result not only of the COVID pandemic, with the economy, with Brexit, in every area of life, the impact of the Biden administration, the impact of the Trump administration would be far worse than what we could see from a Biden administration. This is a leader which the opposition has basically brushed aside. They're essentially saying that, yes, Trump might be an awful leader, but we have to rely on the Republicans. We have to rely on the leader's own party to stop him from making these tremendous mistakes. What kind of confidence does that set? How is a leadership like that? It's all beneficial for the United Kingdom in the next 4 years. I'd much rather have the Democratic Party uniting with Biden, regardless of whatever you think of the Democrats or Biden, than have the shambles of a leadership where we have to rely on the Republican Party of all parties to stop us from complete disaster. Thanks for the question. I hope I answered it.
Any other questions at all from either the speakers or the audience?
Yeah, I have a couple of points of information for Ethan. So Ethan, wouldn't you agree that it would be better for we should be prioritising the UK's economic position and the safety and job security of our own people rather than any sort of environmental or American party issue. Don't you think that our priority should first and foremost be the safety of our own people?
I mean, absolutely. You know, this government does not have to prioritise climate over the economy. It doesn't have to prioritise climate with the economy. But in terms of relying on the Trump administration for bringing safety, what we've heard tonight has essentially shown us that Trump is a candidate. He's probably one of the historically most awful candidates for ensuring any type of peace. Now, this is a candidate who's essentially, our diplomats are referring to him as kind of like a coin toss. You know, Boris Johnson administration has had to have its diplomat resigned over his, over his tried and true, criticisms of Donald Trump, which everyone agrees with. I don't think that this is an administration that we have to. This isn't an administration that we can have any confidence in if they're going to bring us any peace. I think for the United Kingdom's sake, that we would do much better under the Biden administration.
Okay, we have a question from Matthew Harris to Sibylla. Surely the environmental issues are the safety of our people. It is the safety of their future and their livelihood.
Hi, Matthew. Yes, the environment is important and it is definitely something we shouldn't be pushing away, but we are talking about a 2-month deadline to find a Brexit agreement and to potentially reverse some of the damage created by Brexit and the pandemic and the potential bad or no deal created by Brexit. And so as much as the environment is a very important issue, it is definitely a lot more long term, and we need to act immediately, swiftly, and with immediate impact to help and secure the safety of our people. And that is going to come about through a successful UK-US trade agreement with Trump and Boris Johnson.
May I also respond, Sean?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I think, yes, the environment is obviously really important, and it is the future of our livelihoods and our children's livelihoods whenever that happens. But I would kind of agree with the premises more if we were seeing the opposition Democrat leader be someone like really radical, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez proposing something like the Green New Deal, which would really lead to rapid climate change development. But the problem is, Joe Biden's presidency wouldn't improve climate change all that much, because let's not forget, he still supports fracking. He's still going to be quite slow on the transition from oil. Joining the Paris Climate Accord agreement isn't going to change that much. The main polluters are still places like China, and I don't see Biden being able to get that much concessions out of China just because he's in the Paris Climate Agreement. So while it is true that climate is important, and I would say, in that aspect, maybe Trump is slightly, well, not maybe slightly, is worse than Biden. Biden isn't going to improve the climate that much. It's not like a Biden presidency is going to save the climate and don't worry, guys, climate change is over, global warming's over because Joe Biden won the presidency. It's still going to be a problem. And that kind of requires more worldwide cooperation. But again, you're not going to get that through the UN or just because Joe Biden got elected. That's just going to require each nation to wake up to the fact that it's in their own self-interest to change the climate, really.
Thank you. We have a question from Anna for either or Sibylla and Jamie. What about the health consequences for the UK people caused as a result of Trump's disregard for the science on COVID-19?
I guess I'll respond to that, really. While it's true that Trump and his response to COVID-19 hasn't been particularly great, I don't think you've seen a huge impact on what Trump's rhetoric or his actions have really led to an impact on the UK. Most people wear masks. You're not really going to see many people saying, well, I don't wear the mask and I live in the UK because Donald Trump said so. I mean, I don't think there's really a statistical basis that because Trump's response to COVID-19 has been bad, it's led to the UK's response being bad. I think, if anything, the UK's kind of looked at the Trump presidency and said, well, we're not really going to copy him on COVID-19. So I get that Trump's COVID-19 response really isn't a great factor for him being re-elected if you're looking at it from a US perspective and whether or not you should re-elect Donald Trump. I'm not sure I would really go as far as to say that's really impacted on the UK particularly. But, you know, his response hasn't been great, I will admit that.
Okay, another question, which I think is again for you both, from Matthew again. As a major global power, the US is important in all of this. Arguing that Trump is only slightly worse is missing the point. Would you not argue that a small benefit from one of the world's largest superpowers is still necessary and should not be ignored?
I mean, yeah, there is a small benefit, but I think you've got to look at it this way. I'm not sure Biden really leads to that benefit all that much. I mean, I wouldn't mind if we had a presidency that was against fracking, or he was against, you know, he was totally for full transition to renewable energy by like 2030. I think that would make sense. But if Biden gets elected, I don't really see countries following his example. And maybe it wouldn't be the best thing if they did follow his example, because he's still quite far behind other countries. I mean, frankly, you want to see better benefits from the countries that really are having an impact. You know, like, all in all, the US is bad, but it's not the worst country in the world. What you really need to start seeing the improvement for is places like, you know, China, for example. And I understand that, you know, Trump, you know, his statements on climate change can sometimes harm it in American discourse. But the problem is, it's like, you've still seen in certain areas improvements under Trump. Water's got cleaner in certain areas. And, you know, there's been some transition in certain areas towards renewables. I don't see them being a huge impact in Biden. And I don't see why we should risk global recession, which will probably mean that we would have to, you know, use fossil fuels more in this country because we don't have the means to produce energy through wind because we can't afford it, just because Biden might bring a small tangential improvement in climate change. I mean, the math doesn't really add up. I think, if anything, we might end up producing more than Biden helps because we can't use wind, because we can't afford it, because oil is our only way of doing it because we don't have the money. It's just how I see it personally. But.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I quickly just add to Matthew's point? The small benefit would be largely defeated by the huge suffering, or just the problems that it would then cause to the UK. So if you're talking about a small benefit, you know, sort of for the greater good is definitely to protect the British and therefore have the Trump presidency. Trump being actively against any help, we are focusing on the UK. If this were an argument for whether Trump would be beneficial for the environment, it would be a relevant point, but this is an argument for the UK. And then your third point, are you arguing that the UK will cause a global recession if they don't have a trade deal with the US? Not necessarily, but the recession would definitely be in the UK. So the environment does not.
Oh yeah, it definitely wouldn't be a global recession. We're looking at a localized recession in the UK. But again, as I said, I'm not sure it helps the environment in the UK, because if we go into recession, our wind usage and our renewable usage will go down because it's a less reliable means, because we don't yet have the capacity to use it in a reliable sense because it's more costly. So I think if anything, it'd make it worse, because I don't see Biden having a huge impact in the US. And if anything, it will cause a negative in the UK. So I don't think it actually helps the environment in the grand scheme of things, to be fair.
All right. Thank you for all the questions. Thank you for all the speakers and the answers. We're now going to do another poll again by kind of voting with the thumbs up or hands raised on the motion again. So if you are in favour of the motion that this House believes a second Trump presidency would be more beneficial for the UK, can you use the raise your hand function for the next 20 seconds or so? Okay, And if you're against the motion, vote now. And if you're abstaining on the motion, then vote now. Okay, thank you very much. We've had a slight shift from abstain to against. No movement at all for the argument in favour, unfortunately for them. But in that case, this House opposes the motion that a second Trump presidency would be more beneficial for the UK. So in that case, we'll be moving on to our guest speakers, who are Sarah Elliott, the chair of the Republicans Overseas UK, and Professor Bill Barnard from Democrats Abroad UK. And Sarah Elliott will be going first, as the motion is obviously focusing on Trump. And the introduction for her is as follows. Sarah Elliott is the chair of Republicans Overseas UK, the chapter for expatriates Republican Party supporters who live in the United Kingdom, with over 1,000 members throughout the country. Her background is in GOP politics, having worked for Grover Norquist at Americans for Tax Reform, Americans for Prosperity, and is a veteran of many Republican political campaigns, such as Bush-Cheney in 2004. The Republican Overseas UK itself started in 2013, and it succeeded Republicans Abroad for Republican Americans living and working overseas. As a country chapter, Republicans Overseas UK has 3 objectives, which are as follows: being a voice for Republican Americans in the UK, encouraging voter participation in US elections, representing the interests of overseas Americans on a wide range of issues, including tax reform. So over to Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. You make me long to miss my university days a bit. All right, well, I'll preface this by saying 4 years ago, I didn't vote for President Trump. I couldn't decide who to vote for. I was definitely not with her, Hillary Clinton. She did not share my politics, and I actually did agree with Trump that she's crooked Hillary. But I couldn't quite see how an orange-tinted, bombastic guy who's more like a professional wrestler than a statesman could be president of the United States or even the head of the party of Lincoln. But 4 years on, I've had no trouble and I should back up a second, on my ballot, I voted for Congress and then I left the presidency blank. And I really did take an intellectual exercise in this because I'm a lifelong conservative. I'm an American conservative before I'm a Republican. And to me, I just thought that Donald Trump was Hillary Clinton masquerading as a conservative. And maybe he still is a New York liberal like herself, but he's definitely governed as a conservative, which is why he has earned my vote. And when I went to vote, I did not hesitate this time. I had my baby strapped to me. I filled in my little bubble, put it in the post. No thinking was necessary. And a lot of that has to do with with his foreign policy. And when I'm married to a Brit, I live out the special relationship every day. I have 2 children now who are both Anglo-Americans. And I want, our countries to have the best relationship possible. My mother, lived in Yorktown, Virginia, where you all surrendered to the United States. And I just think that, ever since then, we've been able to forge a wonderful partnership and great defenders of the free world. And so you have in President Trump someone who also sees that. I mean, he is half British himself. His mother is Scottish. He has business interests here in Scotland. I wouldn't be surprised in the future if there's a Trump Tower in London, or maybe you all won't let him do that. But I'm sure he would like to do that. He's been, probably the most statesmanlike we've ever seen the president was when he was with the Queen. And I would say one of the women he most admires in the world is the Queen herself. And so I just think when you look at Biden, You know, he's very proud of his Irish heritage, which is fine. I'm proud of my Irish heritage. But he's also, you know, helped get Jerry Adams a visa when he was still connected to paramilitary groups. And now he's threatening not to do a free trade agreement with the UK if there's a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And right now in the internal market bill, that's just not up for discussion. So he's already showing the UK that, look, I'm not Donald Trump, I'm not your ally. He's also said, you know, last year, he described Boris Johnson as a kind of physical and emotional clone of President Trump. Now, after listening to all of you, that's really insulting to you. You don't like President Trump and you don't want your head of state to be compared to him. But it's true that he likes Brexit and he wants to do a free trade agreement. And Biden has made it clear that he is more of a globalist and multinational institutionalist. He would prioritize EU over the UK, that's for sure. But President Trump has also enlarged the war chest of NATO. He's garnered more defense spending by NATO allies to the tune of 130 million, with commitments and promises of 400 million over the next 4 years. He's also not taken us into any other military entanglements or conflicts. And that's been mentioned before, but you know, it is the first time since World War II that we have a president who has not sent American soldiers overseas, and thus we haven't turned to our best ally, the United Kingdom, and asked you to put your men and women on the line either. And in terms of Syria, he bombed because they were chemically using chemical weapons on their citizens. And fortunately, that stopped afterwards. There is no war with Iran, and they took out one of the most egregious global terrorists in the world who had killed British soldiers, Soleimani. I think he's made the world a safer place, especially with peace agreements with Israel, normalizing relationships with Arab countries, and even today doing a historic agreement with Sudan, and creating peace with Kosovo and Serbia. Then you also have Secretary Rick Gates, the former US Secretary of Defense for both Obama and President Bush, who said, actually, Biden has been on the wrong side of foreign policy for the last 40 years. And it was Biden who most recently said that, well, China, you don't have to worry about them. Come on, they can't compete with us. And you don't have to, they're not the bad guys. Oh, really? Oh, really, Mr. Biden? They're not the bad guys? Or are they paying you for access at the moment? Have they bought you off? Which has recently come up as a possible question relating to emails found on his son's computer, which was very irresponsibly left at a repair shop. So, you know, I mean, I understand that, you know, Mr. Trump is not an easy person to listen to, especially with English and British sensibilities. He's hard for many Americans. His New York accent can be grating. He's, you know, he's orange, let's face it. But he's a strong man in a world where there are many adversaries to the West. And with a very strong China, Trump is the only one in America and now the world who's trying to renegotiate our relationship with them, has built a strong military and increased military spending year on year. And a strong American military is strong for the UK. Because remember, when Russia or China comes to try to attack you, who do you rely on? You rely on a strong US military. I think because of Biden's age and possible his acuity, that our enemies around the world will see him as weak if he gets elected president. He's also going to be a rubber stamp for the radical left in the United States who wants to transform America. And the reason I say that is because the radical left has taken over the Democratic Party. And the only reason that the moderates put Joe Biden up as the candidate is because he is malleable, and he has never stood on one principle firmly throughout his entire career that he hasn't changed his vote or his position on. So he's very manipulative, or as I said, malleable. And his vice president is one of the most radical left-wing senators in the US Senate. All of these factors, although they be domestic, will influence foreign policy in a Biden White House. You all talk about Alexandria Cortez. I'm telling you, she has a much greater influence than you probably think. The Green New Deal, which I think, quite frankly, would bankrupt America, and a bad economy for the US is not good for foreign direct investment from the UK. In fact, we are each other's largest foreign direct investors. And we had the best economy in at least 50 years under Trump prior to COVID. It's true, Bill. And the unemployment rate was the lowest. Median income was the highest. We had a booming manufacturing sector, over 500,000 jobs created, unemployment at 3.5%, GDP at 4%, which economists in the West thought was not possible. It is true, you can check the Census Bureau. So all of this is what we need to get back to. And we need to get back to this, we need to get back to normal. And you know, actually America's having kind of a V-shaped recovery right now. We lost 40 million jobs. We're almost halfway through recovering those jobs. We're also dropping the unemployment rate rapidly. All of this is good for the UK, but Biden wants to reverse these tax cuts. Which will reverse our economic prosperity. And that will make us a weaker ally for you, a weaker partner to defend against our foes like Iran and China and North Korea. Or you could have Donald Trump, as kind of crazy as he is, he's kind of the man for the moment in dealing with these threats and in supporting the American way, the American Constitution, the right to free speech and expression. All of these wonderful principles, which we actually modeled after you, the UK. Listen, I'm very concerned about my country. I'm very concerned about civil unrest. I'm very concerned about my fact as a conservative that I would be confronted by a Black Lives Matter protester and they would try to force me to put a fist in the air, which I would never do. I'm concerned about the state of the cities that they're in, from the burning and the looting and the rioting of the Democrats, and the horrible state of our education system because of the Democratic teachers unions. I am terrified at actually raising my children in a world where maybe they will be afraid to say that they are Christian and go to church and believe in Jesus Christ. So these are all concerns I have. We need America to be strong on individual freedoms and liberties if it's going to be a leader in the free world. And I fear what would happen under a Biden administration, because a weak ally, a weak America is a weak ally. So anyways, that's my motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah Elliott. If people have questions, you'll be able to ask them. Well, you can ask them sort of in the chat now, but we'll read them out to both speakers after our second speaker, which is Professor Bill Barnard, who is a Democrat by inheritance, passing out flyers for Adlai Stevenson in 1952 with his father. He's also a Democrat by persuasion. By 1960, was campaigning for John F. Kennedy in the Deep South at age 18. He's attended 5 Democratic conventions, 2 as a member of his state delegation, and 3 as a political analyst and commentator for statewide public television networks. And he's also attended 2 Republican conventions as an analyst and a commentator. He has a PhD from the University of Virginia, is a university professor, and is the author of Dixiecrats and Democrats. He's a former chair of Democrats Abroad UK and the former international treasurer of Democrats Abroad, which is the official arm of the Democratic Party of the United States for all Americans living abroad. Over to you, Professor Bill. Thank you.
Thank you for having us. It's been enjoyable listening to the speakers who've come before. I do want to correct a couple of factual things that Sarah just said, which are simply untrue. And I hope there's some economic students in the audience who can go and check, fact check it. GDP was significantly, the growth in GDP was significantly higher in the 50s and 60s, and indeed in the early 90s than it has been under Donald Trump. He never reached 4%. The number of jobs created in the last 3 years of the Obama administration was greater than the number of jobs created in the first 3 years of the Trump administration before the virus. In fact, the number of manufacturing jobs today in the US before the virus is lower than it was when Trump became president. I don't want to dwell on that, nor do I want to dwell on the kinds of scurrilous comments that were made, and I'll just leave those and let them lie and let you judge them for yourself. But I do want to make 3 points plus an auxiliary one at the end. The first one is that the peace and security and prosperity of the UK, of the US, and of our allies will be better served by a Biden administration than a continuation of the Trump administration. Trump has undermined every institution and every alliance that has undergirded the security and prosperity of the UK, of Europe, and of the US since the end of World War II. He coddles our adversaries and antagonizes our allies. No better example than that of NATO, where he questioned the fundamental premise that underlies the NATO alliance. He's shown a special animus to almost every multilateral institution or agreement that following World War II was established to deal with the dangers that the UK faces and the US faces around the globe. Whether you're talking about the WHO, the Paris Peace Accords, I agree to some of the comments earlier about how limited that really is and how more symbolic than anything else. The Iran agreement, the arms control agreements, TPP, which was an effort to set the rules of the road in trade in the Pacific, which become increasingly important and which we withdrew from and left the field open to the Chinese to exploit both militarily, diplomatically, and commercially. Many of those institutions, and those alliances need to be reformed. They're flawed in some respects. They don't achieve as much as we need to achieve now. They were suited for a certain time and place when they were drawn. We need to reform them and recast them perhaps, but we don't need to scuttle them. We need to revitalize them. Biden will return these relationships to a healthy situation and reform and repurpose them if necessary. The second point I won't dwell upon because it really is a domestic one. I'm not going to go through the domestic arguments. That's not what you're here for, domestic US arguments. But if the US is to play a responsible role in international affairs with the UK, it has to be strong domestically, internally. And I believe that a Biden presidency on almost any level is going to be have greater success in achieving that than the divisive tone that Trump sets. The third point is that the real challenge of the next century is the rise of China. That relationship will have to be multi-layered. There will be certain aspects that are adversarial. There will be certain aspects that are competitive. There will be other aspects that have to be collaborative if we are to address some of the issues that were mentioned earlier. China is the largest polluter in the world. India is following closely behind. And we do require some way of working, even with people that we, in other aspects, are our adversaries. But the US, but those difficult relationships that have to be forged with China and against China will be far more difficult if we don't rally the support of our allies, in particular the UK. The US and the UK and those governments committed to freedom and the rule of law can best achieve a peaceful, evolving relationship with China by working together, not by going it alone as the US has tried to do. The other point, those are the 3 points that I would make. I'll leave you with and I'll be brief about them. The other point, though, I would make is one that occurred to me while Sibylla was speaking. There did seem to be an undertone there, that an assumption that the UK is to be an adversary in its relationship with the EU necessarily, and thus seeks comfort from the US, which I don't necessarily think to be the case. But there's one thing about Biden. He's of a certain age, I know because I'm the same generation, a certain age and a certain generation that understands, accepts, and appreciates the particularly special relationship that exists between the United States and the UK. Trump's ignorance of history, particularly of the history of the 20th century, and of the international roles that the UK has played in harmony with the US, means that he is often unaware of or hostile to that relationship. And I believe the UK's future would be far more secure, far more pleasant in a Biden presidency than in the presidency of Donald Trump.
Thank you very much, Professor Bill. Again, if you have any questions for either speaker, please put them in the chat and I will ask them. So the first question we have is for Sarah Elliott, which says, you are scared that your children won't be able to go to church and say they are Christian. What about the non-white, non-Christian, non-heterosexual citizens of the United States who are also scared to live their life at the moment?
Well, I think everybody should be able to live freely and worship however they choose, as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else. And I think, and live their life the way they want to. I mean, I'm a conservative because I want the government to leave me alone. I want to raise my kids, run my business, that, you know, go to church, mosque, or synagogue without the government interfering. And I think it's horrible that anybody would ever feel unsafe. I believe in treating people the way you want to be treated. But right now, you know, I'm sorry, but the culture is reversed. It's a post-Christian society. You know, Republicans in particular, if you're conservative, are automatically called racist. You're considered one already. Even if you espouse these beliefs, you can't talk about them openly. I mean, there's a real shy Trump voter right now because of the cancel culture, and I fear that the PC cancel culture, both in this country and in the US, has just gone too far, and it's now stifling freedom of expression and freedom of speech. And so that's what I'm alluding to. But I think everybody should be able to live their life and be treated with respect.
Thank you. Professor Bill Barnard, do you want to come back on that at all?
Not particularly on that point, but on a point that Sarah made in passing, and that is that she's a conservative because she doesn't want the government telling her what to do. Does that apply to women in the control of their reproductive process?
I am pro-life, and unabashedly, I will die on that hill. And I am that way because I have seen the heartbeats of my children at 8 weeks. And I know that that is a life. And I believe in protecting the life in the womb because they don't have anyone else to protect them or give them a voice because they are the voiceless. So I believe in the Constitution when it wants to protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And life is the first one. And I feel that those that are in the womb need defenders. And I do believe that life begins at conception. And
do you believe the government should have the right to impose your views on others who might disagree?
I think that the government has a right to defend life. So our country needs to decide, when does life begin, and defend it there.
And you've made that decision, and you would impose that on others.
Sorry.
I understand.
There are other questions as well, and I know this topic is obviously quite a heated one. We can go back and forth a lot on very strong views on this particular issue. We've got another question for Sarah again. Has Trump emboldened racism in the United States and overseas for his actions? For example, his statement on the Proud Boys, stand back and stand by, and in Charlottesville, oops, sorry, it's just gone. And in Charlottesville, for example, there are good people on both sides.
First off, I think it's quite unfortunate in this day and age that the media and what it chooses to talk about and how it portrays it gives you a very one-sided view of the president and the Republican Party. And so I challenge all of you to go and listen to both sides of the argument, because there is not balanced news. If you know, and there are conservative news websites you can compare with the mainstream news. That being said, the president he said that, he's at Charlottesville, he said that, and then right immediately after he said that, that doesn't mean the neo-Nazis and the white supremacists, but that gets cut out. And you can go and hear the audio for yourself. So he was taken out of context in that instance. Do I think he's fanned the flames of racism? No. In fact, I think the media has done that because they have a narrative. I think the left has it because they want to peg all of us as racist, even though we are the party of Lincoln. And actually, Trump has been fantastic with minorities. This is actually something really interesting. And if you're a political hack like myself, I encourage you to follow the minority vote this election, because you're seeing something in the Democratic Party that hasn't happened in over 50 years, and that is when the minorities are starting to reconsider the way they have historically voted. And because of Trump's criminal justice reform, funding historically Black colleges with $250 million a year promises, and putting economic zones in urban areas and depraved urban areas, the black vote is going, hang on a second, you've done more for me than Barack Obama. You've done more for me than any Democratic president. The unemployment rate's been the lowest for Black people since the 1960s. And to Bill's point, he mentioned some economic numbers from the 50s and 60s. Yes, I would say that these are record numbers that go back to the Lyndon B. Johnson administration. It goes that far, but we haven't seen them since. And so I actually think he's been helpful to the Black community, and I am fascinated to see if he can get over 12%. I'm thinking Trump might actually get somewhere around 15 to 18% of the Black vote. He is polling very well with Black males and Hispanic males.
Okay, we have a question for Bill, which is, whilst Biden may provide some leadership to international work towards dealing with the climate crisis, will this lessen the voice of other nations' voices in international action in dealing with the climate crisis? So currently with Trump away from the climate scene, the UK has been able to lead in some places such as COP26.
I don't understand the premise of the question, actually.
Shall I ask it here?
Yeah.
I just mean, like, in relation to, will America coming back on to sort of trying to lead agreements and push for more sort of international action around climate change, will it push other countries like the UK, for example, back into sort of second place in having a role in leading such things?
That was certainly not the case of what happened in Paris with the Paris Accords. That certainly did not happen to be the case. In fact, it was not only countries of the size of the UK that played a major role, but it was much smaller countries as well. I'm sorry, I concentrated on the earlier question that was in the chat box about China. I don't know whether you want me to address that one or not.
Yeah, I was going to ask that straight after as well. So go ahead. I'll just read it out for the audience's sake. Okay. So it's for Bill again. You state that China is the greatest threat to the United States. Has Trump not done more in the reduction of China's power than Biden is suggesting he will do if he gets elected?
I wouldn't say that China is the greatest threat. I think China is the greatest challenge to the US and to the rest of the world, quite frankly. One of the things that's true that I think is underappreciated abroad is how strongly the anti-Chinese sentiment is in both parties. You'll not find a stronger anti-China advocate than Chuck Schumer of New York, for example. It is true that we've all been aware, not only in the US, but elsewhere in the UK and in Europe, of the degree to which the Chinese have engaged in the theft of intellectual property, the degree to which they have not played by the rules, even though they were admitted to international organizations which indicated that they intended to. And I think that something needs to be done, a forceful action needs to be taken, but it won't be taken, it won't be best taken by the unilateral role that Trump has pursued. It will best be taken if the US, in concert with the UK, with the European Union, and with others in Asia as well, Japan, Australia, Singapore, South Korea, to pressure the Chinese to be law-abiding and accept the rule of law, and to change some of their internal practices about how they deal with foreign corporations that want to operate within their borders. So I don't think that there's that much difference, in fact, to choose between the two. I think Trump has been, particularly once things didn't go very well with the trade war with China, he's turned upon Xi, and rather than being very complimentary and all the rest as he was in the early months, including the early months of this year, including his dealing, Xi's dealing with the virus in China itself. He has taken a more bellicose line, in part because he thinks that will benefit him politically. But I think the reality is that there's a large degree of commonality in the position, not necessarily of Trump and bombast, but between the thoughtful members of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party as well.
Okay, thank you. Couple of questions for Sarah now. The first one being, would the pro-life movement not do better by having the government provide more support to single mothers and low-income families?
Well, that's a great point. I mean, that's a big platform in the pro-life movement, is that actually we don't want the woman to have to choose between her life and the baby. We want to be supportive of both, and we want to make sure that she and the child have all the resources at their disposal. However, the conservative in me does not necessarily want the government to be providing funding. I'd much rather see civil society fill that void. Church, whether it's churches or community centers or local charities, I would much rather see that happen. But I do believe that society has a role to play to step up and support women who are in these crises and have, a very difficult decision to make.
Thank you. And then another question relating again to sort of government interference. You state that the government should not interfere, but do you accept that the actions that have been taken in Portland, for example, by Homeland Security, the force used earlier this year against protests, make America appear increasingly authoritarian to the wider world? And so how can America condemn China's approach to Hong Kong protests, for example, if it takes aggressive actions toward its own citizens?
Well, for one, I mean, it's the U.S. police in Portland have not behaved as the Chinese authorities or the Hong Kong authorities. I'm sorry. And these Antifa activists have been incredibly violent. They're going after federal property. So based on the rule of law, we need to defend the federal property. And for over 100 days, people were taking weapons and attacking police, sending them to hospital, burning things, attacking precincts. I mean, this is just pure vandalism and destruction. And so there has to be some sense of control. And what I find incredible, and this is why I'm worried about a Biden presidency and moving so far to the left, is that he's not forcefully condemned in very clear terms or stepped in any way to stop this from continuing. And it's troublesome. And President Trump, if you're worried that he's a fascist or an authoritarianism, he's not. He's showing extreme restraint because he's offered the National Guard to come and help Ted Wheeler, the mayor of Portland, out to get this under control and stop this absolute wasteful destruction of private property and public property. And the mayor has not accepted it. He still, goes around trying to peddle and win influence with these Antifa people who even go after his own house. So I think it's I think that they're hoodlums, and you have to have police out there. And if they're attacking the police have to be able to defend themselves. But I do understand that policing in America is a dangerous business because we are armed, and more often than not, the criminals are armed illegally. And so it does make policing difficult.
Thank you. Another question for Bill. Is there an argument to be made that both Johnson and Biden are fundamentally incompatible? So, for example, Biden's statement about Johnson being another Trump, or Biden's link to the Labour Party when he imitated Neil Kinnock's speech in his 1988 presidential campaign?
I hope there's someone among the students who remembers that marvelous quote, that scurrilous quote from Boris Johnson about Trump. I can't remember it right off, but there is a marvelous one where he is very very hostile to, and he puts him down very greatly in a very colorful ways you might expect from Boris Johnson. The latter part of the question was, the Biden quote, the Neil Kinnock quote. I was asked 8 years ago in a conversation with John Humphrey on the Today Show on Radio 4, that very question. It was when Biden had just been nominated as vice president. I had gone on and on about some of his attributes and all the rest. And then John asked me about this allegation in the 1988 campaign of plagiarism against Biden, that he had in fact borrowed phrases from a Neil Kinnock speech. It's absolutely true. Some staffer who wrote the speech, in fact, had read the Kinnock speech, liked the wording, and put it into Biden's speech. But there's a couple of things, a couple of points I made at the time. One was that there is a statute of limitations on these kinds of mistakes made by staffers and all the rest of them that are then repeated by the people who are responsible for them. But beyond that, the statement itself was absolutely true. It had to do with the fact that both Neil Kinnock and Biden were the first people in their families to go to college and university. So that there was nothing it was no idea that was chosen. It was the precise words that were chosen by some staffer. So I don't think that's much of an indication of the character of the individual. I think we do see, in contrast, the character of Joe Biden, who was leaving office when he left the Senate after 40 years, roughly, one of the poorest men in the Senate, unlike so many others who enriched themselves over time. If you ask people who've been around Washington, D.C. for some time about the kind of character of this individual, who has a sense of honor, who has a sense of what service in an idea that transcends yourself and your narrow personal interest, that goes beyond personal pique, that goes beyond these silly, childish, fourth grader kinds of name calling and all the rest, you'll get an indication of what the real character of these two individuals is.
Thank you again. And we're going to have one final question, which is from Sibylla, again to Sarah. Wouldn't you agree that it is hypocritical for the government to stop abortion, but then force potentially poor communities to protect the single parents created by this very action?
I mean, I don't know. Don't you think it's cruel that you kill a child? Listen, I think that, again, as I said previously, I believe in the community coming and supporting the single mother and the parent, but I don't believe that taking the life of a person, of a human being, is a good thing, is morally good. And so I believe that we need to stop putting women in a position where they have to choose. Like that. I think, in today's world, we can have it all. I mean, look at Amy Coney Barrett. She's able to have a great law career and 7 children of her own. Why can't we embrace both in our lives, motherhood and work, and also for single women who find themselves in a crisis? I think that, they think that having an abortion can be an easy way out, and it's not. It has lasting effects on women and on the father as well. And so, listen, if it requires the government to put more funding so that we can have more babies in this world, then I'm okay with that. I think our communities and our families should be the priority, and that women shouldn't be taken advantage of when they're in these crises. They need to be given support.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to ask both of you to say 1 or 2 sentences to kind of sum up if there's anything else you want to add before we finish. So again, Sarah Elliott going first, and then Bill Barnard to follow. So anything you'd like to say?
I guess I'll say, with, 9 days out from the election, just that I still think it's anyone's game. I'm not entirely, sure who will win. I think it'll be a really interesting, election to watch, as American elections have become really interesting because we're such a divided country, and we're never quite sure who's gonna win in the end. And we may not know on November 4th. We may, or yeah, the next day. I hope it's just a really decisive election so that we can end any kind of litigation or lawyering that can take place. And I know for a fact that whoever is the president of the United States, that the United Kingdom will still play a huge role, will still be our top ally, and will continue to do military and intelligence sharing. And I'm hopeful for a Trump presidency because I would love an exceptionally strong Anglo-American alliance. And I think that's the best bet for one, and also the best bet for a free trade deal for this country. But regardless of who's president or prime minister, our countries will remain strong. And I'm proud of that.
Thank you very much. And Professor Bill Barnard, anything you'd like to add or say?
I agree with the closing comments that Sarah made about the nature of the relationship and our hope for it moving forward. And I think that will, in fact, be the case. I too hope for a decisive election, though perhaps in the opposite direction from which Sarah does. But I do think that the country needs that, quite frankly. We need it to be able to bind up the wounds that we have inflicted upon ourselves over the past 4 years, largely because of the current president. My fear is that on election day, my mother worked at the polls for 40 years, and I never thought I would have a fear that people would show up in open carry and concealed carry states with guns at polling places, trying to intimidate or indicate something by their presence there. But I'm afraid that likely will happen this time, and I'm afraid of what might happen in some of those places. I do hope that it is decisive and that we do know fairly early on. If I would give any advice to you about what to look for, the one state you probably ought to look for early on is Florida, because Florida, unlike many of the other states, opens its ballots before the election day and begins to tabulate them, the mail-in ballots. So that will all be done. And the first reports from Florida will have those ballots already counted in them. And you should get a fairly reasonable count very early from Florida. It is true that they will accept ballots from overseas for 10 days, I think it is, if they're postmarked before the election day. So there'll be a change between that and the certified vote, the final vote, but it won't be large, it won't be significant. So look for that as a key. If Trump wins, we're in for a very close election. If Biden wins, it's basically over for Trump. There's no way that he can get to 270 if he loses Florida. I would have one word of suggestion to any of your listeners there, any of the students there who are Americans or who know American students there. There are some states where it is still possible to request a ballot by email and to have it returned to you by email and print it out, go through the instructions, be very careful in going through the instructions and mail it out. You still got 11 days. You actually could still vote even at this late date. So if there are any of your students there who are Americans and who do want to vote, I encourage them to go to votefromabroad.org, votefromabroad.org. It is a nonpartisan site, although it was originally developed by Democrats, but nonetheless it serves Republicans, Democrats, anyone who wishes to. And they put in their state, it'll come up with what they need to put in. They put it in, they send it off by email. They'll get back fairly quickly by email a copy of their ballot.
Yeah. Oh, can I just say one last thing?
Make it very, very quick then, sorry.
It's really a public service announcement. If any of you know of any Republicans on campus who might like to start a chapter at Cambridge, I'd be really interested to hearing from them. We'd love to have one there. We have one at Oxford, and I know you guys can have one too. So.
And they can oppose joint events with the Democrats Abroad chapter at Cambridge.
Yeah.
Thank you very much to both our guest speakers, Professor Bill Barnard and Sarah Elliott. Thank you to everyone who's debated. Reminder that obviously the debaters don't necessarily agree with Trump or Biden. They are debating for the sake of debating. Also just want to say that thank you especially for kind of a direct American kind of sort of perspective, because I know obviously a lot of our information from both sides does come very secondhand, and it can be very good to kind of see exactly what both Republicans and Democrats are actually thinking. I do want to mention that the debate in 2 weeks' time will be on "This House Believes Cancel Culture Has Gone Too Far." So if you're interested in attending or speaking at that, message the page, or there's a form on our Facebook page which allows you to sign up as a potentially interested speaker in this or any other debate. But thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and to our speakers and debaters again.
Thank you.